think that the limits of British interference in that war-torn country have been more than reached, but they do not include the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He says Afghanistan represents the, quote, biggest humanitarian crisis of our times, requiring the global action that should be global action to stop the country's economic and social collapse. Mr. Brown said more than half of the Afghan population was facing extreme hunger, including 1 million children who are at risk of starving to death. Well, let's turn to Dr. Alan Mendoza, the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, the transatlantic foreign policy and national security think tank, who joins me. Alan, thanks for your time. There will be people listening to the words of Gordon Brown and wringing their hands, really, and saying, yes, it's an awful condition that this poor, benighted, embattled country finds itself in, but the West has done everything it can to create the stable conditions where prosperity and stability might flourish, but ultimately we weren't needed, and in a sense the consequences that follow from that can't be laid at our door, or can they?
Well, it's a very interesting question, Colin, isn't it? I mean, the nature of how we withdrew was seemingly not a concern about what would happen thereafter, suggests in a moment that we do have some responsibility for what follows. That doesn't mean you're there forever. That doesn't mean you have to necessarily do what Gordon Brown has suggested. But part of the reason the withdrawal was so disastrous, I think, was because these questions were simply not addressed, and nobody thought what might happen the day after that withdrawal. And so, to a certain extent, it'll be interesting to see what exactly the architect of the withdrawal, President Biden, intends to do now.
I mean, again, there'll be people saying, well, there's lots of other parts of the world where we should be spending the hard-won British taxpayers' pounds. This isn't necessarily one of them, but I know those people, and they include people like Richard Dannett, the former head of the British Army, who told me a couple of months ago why he was advocating as strongly as he was for a return to the 0.7% of GDP foreign aid budget in the UK, something which isn't very popular if you poll the general public. And he said, well, look, you have to spend the money in places like Afghanistan, because if you don't, chaos ensues, it becomes a breeding ground for terror, and that ends up on British streets.
Yes, I mean, the part of what we were, I think, what the government wanted to do when it actually decoupled DFID and put it back into the Foreign Office was to try and make decisions like this and to say, actually, what we need to look at are the broader strategic objectives of British foreign policy. And as a result, we need to look at places where, if we put money in, we can prevent the kind of instability that then leads to foreign policy redresses afterwards. So I think there is a lot of truth in what General Dannett has said, in the sense of decisions made in development terms do have a longer-term impact on foreign policy decision-making. But then again, you balance that against reality that when you come to Afghanistan, you're essentially therefore propping up a terrible vile regime like the Taliban.
That's exactly the phrase, isn't it? I mean, that's the problem here. You would be propping up the Taliban. You'd be feeding people they ought to be feeding, creating jobs they ought to be creating, allowing them to focus on their other objectives, which will include destabilising countries like ours.
Yes, and therein lies the problem. Therein lies your challenge. What is actually better for British foreign policy? Is it pump money in the hope that this will pacify the Taliban and leave them to kind of develop in the way that they wish to domestically, which, of course, by the way, is very antithetical to what we would want to see in terms of any countries we were supporting with aid, so let's not forget that side as well. Or secondly, not pumping the money in and then seeing what reacts there. But part of this argument is always going to be, is it not? The Taliban are in charge. They clearly had a reservoir of support among the Afghan people, and we should leave them to get on with it. Here's a very difficult choice. You've got people's lives at stake, obviously, but you have to therefore also think what might happen a year down the line if you either support the Taliban or don't support the Taliban. And those questions will have to be addressed, I think, at the highest level.
Alan Mendoza is the executive director of the Henry Jackson